So with that background, let's move into John chapter 9, verse 1. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man who had been blind from birth, and the disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? It was standard practice for disciples to be continually asking questions of their leaders, as it should be today. We should never stop asking because that's how we grow. However, in this case, the man was blind. He wasn't deaf, and he may very well have heard the disciples' question, and this would cause him even more suffering. So we need to be mindful of our surroundings, maybe perhaps more than the disciples were. The question itself betrays what is called the false dilemma fallacy. And we use the word dilemma in our day to mean any predicament. But if you look at the root, the prefix di actually means two. And the fallacy is when we present or we are presented or we somehow believe that only one of two options must be true. And we ignore the possibility that neither one could be true. And as I mature in the faith, that's one thing that I see Satan loves to do within the church, is present us one of two choices and then we have to pick one. Well, you need to realize there may be partially both true. There may both be untrue. And so that's the importance of being a Berean. We have blindness here in the Bible. Again, as I said when I was talking about the logo, it often signifies spiritual blindness, and sight often signifies spiritual sight. So blindness in terms of not knowing God, and specifically in this case, blindness would be a failure to recognize God's Messiah. In John 9:32, we are told that having been born blind and having that person's sight restored has never happened before. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. So this is exciting stuff here as we get through. The question belies a belief that what you do is direct result of your, some sin. Like what happens to you as a result of some sin. We have this verse in Exodus 20. You shall not worship other gods nor serve them. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, inflicting the punishment of the fathers of the children on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. That's in the Ten Commandments, and that's a little bit uncomfortable because sometimes this verse is presented as evidence that a father's sin can be unknowingly passed down to the children. What we need to know, though, is in Jesus' day and Moses' day, often 3 and 4 generations lived together. They made no distinction between a nuclear family and an extended family. They were all there together. One result of this is that one person in that family couldn't willfully be in sin without the others knowing about it. The elders were expected to intervene so as not to allow shame to fall on the family. When they didn't, then the actions of the elders not doing that or participating in the sin and the family's not holding each other accountable, then that has a direct negative result on the grandchildren. So therefore, you can see that all adults in the entire household will be held accountable, and you can see where this verse might make more sense. But we need to be Bereans. We need to know our Bibles. Ezekiel 18, a person who sins will die. A son will not suffer the punishment of the father's guilt, nor will a father suffer the punishment of the son's guilt. The righteous of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. We are ultimately accountable for our sin and our sin alone, not someone else's. However, there is such a thing as generational sin. The old adage about history is true. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And in that respect, I think one thing God could be saying in the Exodus passage is the general concept of generational sin. But through God's strength, many of us have broken those chains of generational sin and broken those bonds and gone to be fruitful and not repeat the mistakes of the past. Another trick of the enemy is to take one verse like this third and fourth generation and then you run with it. We have to know the whole counsel of God, and that gives us a balanced perspective. We see this today, but definitely in Jesus' day, many believe that good things happen to the righteous and bad things happen to sinners. Now, sin may be and often is a cause of suffering. There is definitely a law of sowing and reaping, but this is not always the case. And we have the book of Job, that is the oldest book in the Bible, some say, that tells us this. Terrible things can happen in a fallen world through no fault of the person who they're happening to. In Job, the only sinner in the entire book, other than the lack of the support of the friends, the main sinner in that book was the pride of the accuser, thinking that he knew better than God. In John 9, the sin is not going to be of the man, Jesus is going to say that in the next verse, but it's actually going to be of the blind accusers who are doing the deeds of their father, the devil. And we saw that in John 8. So again, Satan is working here. Satan is the accuser, and that's where the sin lies here. Our risk for us is kind of the opposite. We think our good deeds must merit extra special favor by God. This is truly a fine line because the Bible does teach that our obediences merit favor, but not in the sense that God owes us something because of our deed. I thought of a mission trip where you go somewhere and your intent is to serve and bless others, and that happens. But usually when I go, I'm the one who ends up being blessed. And this is not because I did something good, but just because that's how God works. It's a blessing associated with humility. I go there and I'm humbled and blessed at the spirit of people that we're supposedly helping, and and we learn as much from them as they learn from us. Expecting God to bless us us as if we are his creditor and he is our debtor is anything but humble. So I think it's where your attitude is, and are you being humble about it in your good deeds? Never boast of your good deeds. Jesus answered, it was neither this man that sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We'll make that our memory verse, because the question asked by the disciples, Jesus' answer was neither. Sometimes we go through trials simply so God can get the glory. This requires spiritual vision to see God at work. John is continuing his overarching theme about light versus darkness, sight versus blindness, and all of that represents one's spiritual state. So Jesus is using this as an example here. John chapter 9, verse 4 and 5, we must carry out the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Note the plural we here. What do you think Jesus means when he says we? What is our personal role in Jesus' ministry at our day and age? Because there is a role. We have a part to play. So think about that, and we'll discuss that when we teach. We must carry out the works of him who sent me. So we have sent is a deliberate pun here. The key geographic landmark in this whole chapter is the pool of Siloam, and we're told in verse 7, Siloam is translated means sent. It's the equivalent of the Greek apostello, which is where we get the word apostle. Elaine Phillips, who wrote in the geographic commentary, says the Hebrew name that provides the basis for Siloam means to send, which amplifies the overall healing event, given Jesus' recent claims to be sent from God and having sent the blind to the living water. So all of this is definitely deliberate here. When it says night is coming where no one can work, that was very true. Before electricity, almost every activity ceased at nightfall. Jesus, of course, is also speaking of his presence as the light and the absence of darkness, coming to be a light in the world, and that's what John is all the way through. As he was dying, that's when darkness fell. It's not when he was in the tomb. That was sundown, but then darkness fell, unnaturally, you might say, when he was dying on the cross. There's also another layer that we'll learn is that this healing is on the Sabbath, and very literally, preparations for the Shabbat or the Sabbath start before sundown on Friday afternoon. But as soon as the sun sets on Friday evening, no one can work. So there might be that in play as well. Jesus also foresees a coming deadline, similar to that Shabbat deadline, where 40 years later, the doom of the nation and the fall of Jerusalem, the work will definitely stop. And Daniel Lancaster picked up on that aspect. Jesus, of course, is the light of the world spiritually for all of us, as well as literally for this man, whose vision will go from darkness to blindness and from light to sight. All this is occurring, as we said in the beginning, against the backdrop of the Feast of Tabernacles, and it had the 4 light towers that were lit up at night, and they illuminated the darkness. In John 8:12, he says he is the light of the world. He says it again here in John 9:5, and the light there is Genesis 1, 3, and 4. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. The upcoming miracle is going to authenticate his claim that he is the light of the world. When he had said this, he spit on the ground and made mud from the saliva and applied the mud to his eyes. This is going to be the 6th major sign in John's gospel, and likely a direct link to Genesis 2:7, where it says the Lord God made man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living person. Now here we've got Jesus mixing his saliva, the water of life. There we have the breath of life. All that is connected there. One of the many layers of John, though, is his connection with Ezekiel. We haven't gotten into that just because it takes a lot of time to connect the dots, but Ezekiel was known for acting out his prophecies, and so what we have here, Jesus is not just healing this man. He is saying, by acting it out in this kind of weird, different kind of way, is all who are in blindness can receive sight. All you need to have is faith. And we also have this connection with the hands of the potter. Jesus is making clay and applying it to the man's face. Isaiah 45, woe to the one who quarrels with his maker, a piece of pottery among the other earthenware pottery pieces. Will the clay say to the potter, what are you doing? Or the thing you are making say, he has no hands. Kneading, applying that substance in a creative act, and then telling the man to go wash were all technically prohibited. They were all Sabbath violations. As we said when we talked about the previous controversies that Jesus got into on the Sabbath, the general consensus was that saving a life was one of the rare exceptions to violating the Sabbath. In Jewish thought, though, whenever a positive command is in conflict with a negative command, so you have a do this command that's in conflict with a do not do this command, the person should obey the positive command. And we talked about before, to Jesus, any act of human compassion, whether it's in an emergency situation or not, is actually the highest expression of the Sabbath. The positive command to love your neighbor was always superior to the command, do not do any work. Remember our illustration that we used a while back? It was of a driver who gets to drive as fast as he wants, regardless of the speed limit, and he never gets a ticket. What kind of driver is in that position? Well, it's an ambulance driver or a firefighter who is on their way to help somebody in need. And so they're doing it out of compassion to help someone else, so they get a pass on the law that says do not speed. Had Jesus done this for his own pleasure or his own gain, I'm speaking hypothetically here, then the same act would have been a violation of the Sabbath, just as, to carry our analogy, when a paramedic or a firefighter speeds while off duty, then they deserve to get a speeding ticket. Verse 7, and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he left and washed and came back seeing. Another relatively recent excavation is the street that leads from the temple down to the pool of Siloam. Archaeologists excavated this street not that long ago. I got to walk it in 2013, and yes, unfortunately, we went the uphill route, not the downhill route. The blind man had to walk down the street to reach the pool of Siloam. And Elaine Phillips, and again in her commentary, says something quite interesting. It's important to pause and imagine this blind man. He's still blind, and he's got clay on his eyes, slowly and painstakingly working his way the half mile through crowded and twisted streets until he reached the pool. And so think about the faith that this man had to have to be obedient to Jesus' command and make that half-mile trek down to the pool of Siloam. You can see an aerial shot here looking down the central valley to the pool of Siloam, and it's largely filled in today, and it's very densely populated too. Jesus sends this man to wash in the pool that's associated with the temple, again, during this Feast of Tabernacles, and the earlier declaration that Jesus made that he was the living water and the light of the world, all that is connected here. John says Jesus is sent over 20 times in his gospel. So there's a definite theme here and a deliberate pun, if we want to use that term, of Jesus being the sent one, and this man is being sent to the pool that has the title that means sent. I think a big thing not to miss here, Jesus could have healed him any way he wanted, but in this acted out parable, if we want to call it, this man was required to act. He could have simply returned to his begging spot with clay on his face and still been blind and said, well, that was kind of worthless. What do we do that for? No, the man was required to obey Jesus' command. And I think the parallel for our age is how many professing believers get baptized and then, they have a touch from Jesus. They get rejoiced, they rejoice for a moment, but then time goes on and they say, well, I don't feel anything different. I guess that didn't work. After God works to save us, Matthew 28:20 says we need to be taught and we need to teach others to obey his commands. We have to be obedient to take the next step. And so typologically, in this acted out parable, the man receives his sight only after he came up out of the water. Even just by going into the water, he still was blind. No one can see underwater without a mask or something like that. But in the same way that we come up from the waters of baptism, that signifies our entrance into Jesus' kingdom the same way the man had a literal sight as he came up out of the water. And so I think the key step is after God works to save us, we have to be obedient to take the next step. We're studying Deuteronomy in another class, and that's what that theme is. You've got to be obedient. It's there. God's given you the gift, but you have to claim it, and it's not just going to be handed to you. You've got to take it, and in some cases, you've got to fight for it. The similar test of obedience awaited Naaman the Syrian, and this is back in 2 Kings 5. Elijah sent a message to Naaman saying, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. He initially balked at the seemingly absurd instruction that was he had leprosy, and so he was sent to Elisha to cure his leprosy. He's a king, so he's asking, why do I need to dip in some river? Further, this man doesn't even give me the courtesy to visit me himself. He sends some underling, and he gets all in a huff. And finally, some underling staff member intervenes and convinces Naaman to immerse in the Jordan. And of course, what happens next? Of course, he's healed. Now, in both cases, God did a work, then issued a command, but Naaman here and the blind man in John 9 had to be obedient to be healed. And I think one takeaway is it's very easy to obey when the instructions make sense, but sometimes God's instructions to us don't make sense. And then we have a choice. Will you and I choose to obey when the command or the instructions just don't seem to make any sense at all? And in this case, both cases, they were a little weird, but God was testing our faith that way. Shiloah or Siloam possibly also has messianic overtones too. Isaiah 8, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah, and they rejoice in Rezins and the sons of Remaliah. The Israelites were warned of an impending judgment for rejecting the waters of Siloam that God provided and that Hezekiah built. These two guys were the kings of Assyria, and they were simultaneously, of course, the enemies of God, but yet they're also instruments of God's judgment, particularly to the northern kingdom. What Jesus is connecting here is that rejecting God's sent one, the Messiah, results in a similar judgment upon those who insist on remaining blind and rejecting the living waters of represented by the pool of Siloam. So the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is this not the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. Still others were saying, no, but he is like him. So we have a mix of genuine surprise as well as the need to discredit the healer. We've got both aspects working here. No one had ever been born blind and had their sight restored. The man himself kept saying, I'm the one. You're looking at him. I'm looking at you now. And they were saying, how then were your eyes opened? And again, eyes opened is a common Hebraism for spiritual sight too. He answered, the man who was called Jesus made mud and spread it on my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed and I received his sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he said, I don't know. John loves to have his characters repeat stories. And this is kind of what happens here. We get a recap here. We're going a little slower and we're going to stop at verse 23. But as you read the entire passage, take note of all of the no's that are in John 9. It's kind of interesting to see what people know and what people don't know. What this man knows is that he has not literally seen Jesus yet, although he has had an encounter with him. And again, that's something we can apply to our day. We haven't seen him face to face yet. We see through a glass dimly now, but someday we'll see him face to face. Now, John, like a good storyteller, he has a flair for the dramatic, and he holds back kind of the punchline here until the middle of the story. They previously brought the man who was previously blind to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath on that day, and Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So he holds back the fact that all of this happened on a Sabbath until well into the story. And we have this little dun dun dun, ominous moment. There's going to be trouble based on this line about the Sabbath. Same thing happened in John chapter 5. It was a Sabbath on that day. Again, also hidden, tucked it back a little bit later in the story that he tells us it was the Sabbath. Then the Pharisees who were asking him again how he received sight. They're not taking yes for an answer. Yes, it was me. They're trying to discredit him still. He said, he applied mud to my eyes and I washed. You have this repetition again. Some of the Pharisees were saying, this man, Jesus, is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform this sign? And as such, there was dissension among them. And here's a sign that says Shin, Beit, and Tav, SBT for Shabbat, and it marks the limit of Sabbath travel, and it was kind of an inscription that was probably made in the 3rd to 5th century AD on one of the rocks near Jerusalem there. Given what this is happening at the temple, we have this term Pharisees. That could mean a general term to mean the temple elite, but it also may have been, if John did intend to limit it to strictly Pharisees, there were two main schools of thought. You had the much more strict school of Shammai. They would be the ones saying he broke the law. And then you have the much more permissive school of Hillel. That's the school that Paul came from, where they would say, well, he did a good thing. And so they had some dissension among us. It's probably more nuanced than that. But again, don't read this as all the Pharisees were against him, because just like in John 7, you had a dissension in the crowd that occurred because of him. Now, you did have this aspect of some people who were just entrenched in their unbelief. And John MacArthur has a set of characteristics of someone who's in that position. First, they set false standards. We call it moving the goalpost today. That's what they're constantly doing. There's never enough evidence to satisfy they exclude and reject any facts that are contrary to their predefined conclusion, and ultimately they're self-centered. Someone that with this level of unbelief is not someone engaging in legitimate inquiry, but someone who's entrenched, and they will not ever admit error despite all the facts to the contrary. This is not the same as a person who is doubting and who is still seeking. There's a big difference between being entrenched in unbelief and having some questions. So they said again to the man who was blind, what do you say about him, since he opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet. And this reminds us of John 4, where the woman said, sir, I perceive you are a prophet. Revelation here is progressive. Remember, he hasn't fully encountered Jesus yet. He's getting there. And we're going to see the man's eyes eventually become fully opened, and he's really going to irk the leadership. We'll look at that in a future lesson. In an attempt to discredit the miracle bringer, they now try to discredit the one who was healed. The Jews then, the Judaioi, did not believe it about him, and that he had been blind and had received sight. Notice John is repeating that over and over again. Until they called the parents of the one who had received his sight, they questioned him, saying, is this your son, who you now say was born blind? Then how does he now see? So they're trying to get his testimony impeached because they didn't like the man's answer. Now, it's interesting that Jewish law prohibits hearsay. The parents can testify that the man is their son and that he was born blind. That's all they know. But anything beyond that is they shouldn't be testifying to, because they don't have firsthand knowledge. His parents then answered and said, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees, we do not know. And we can't tell you because we don't know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. It's not known that, so this is a picture of a bar mitzvah, father and son around 13. That's today's ceremony when a boy comes of age and he takes all the rights of manhood. We don't know when that was, but obviously this blind man is over 13 or maybe over 20, where he is of age and can testify. He's a legal adult. He can testify in the court of law. So the parents refuse to testify how the son now sees or who did it. And so he's basically saying, call another witness. You need to call someone who has better knowledge than we do. His parents said this, and then we get this recap here by John, because they were afraid of the Jews, the Judaioi, for the Judaioi had already reached the decision. Remember, they've already had their mind made up. They're not listening to any contrary evidence. Anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be excommunicated from the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. In Greek, this is kind of interesting, this to be excommunicated from the synagogue, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words in English, but there's only one word in Greek. It literally means de-synagogued. It's important to remember that in the first century, the synagogue wasn't so much a house of worship that was dedicated to only that purpose. It was more of a community center that definitely also included religious activities, but just was not exclusive. So it was not quite the same way that we think of a church or synagogue today. Some speculate that John is engaging in a slight anachronism here because this whole scene is taking place at the temple. So why not just say excommunicated from the temple? Well, Pharisees did not have power to excommunicate anyone from the temple. And so some speculate that John is writing to a later audience after the Roman conquest, a time when the Pharisees and synagogues would have been the order of the day, and for whom the threat of expulsion from the synagogue was just as real, just as Jesus will prophesy later in John 16:2, where he says, they will ban you from the synagogue. The hour is coming where everyone who kills you think that he is offering a service to God. We'll conclude with this thought. It says the parents were afraid of the Jewish leadership. So we have to ask, where is our fear meter? The parents were under a real threat of social ostracism. And so while their fear can't be condoned, at least it is more understandable given what was going on in their society. In contrast, many of us are afraid to confess when the threat is only imaginary, or at worst, it's only very minor. And the question for us is, are we willing to suffer true ostracism when people respond to us with hostility? And another question, how can we counter the influence of peer pressure to be silent about Jesus when we know we should be speaking up? So with those thoughts in mind, we'll conclude there, and we'll see you back next week as we continue in John chapter 9 along the Talmudim way.